In this lecture, I'm going to focus on the case to reduce arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This could potentially include a reduction in sales to the UAE or the United Arab Emirates, because they also back Saudi Arabia in an important war, a war in Yemen, that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, we've already had a discussion about what arms sales are, and of course, it's very simple to understand arms sales to be things like tanks, armored combat vehicles, large scale artillery systems, combat aircraft, attack helicopters, etc. But it's important to remember that these also include the parts and maintenance for those arms sales. And there's a second piece of evidence there. If you don't have this piece of evidence, you can also download this PowerPoint or in Keynote format from the website, and you can access and see all the additional things that arms sales include, because reductions in these categories and the type of support will be very important to securing one of the advantages, the Yemen advantage, that is discussed. Before proceeding further, I do think it's important to just kind of generally understand where Saudi Arabia is, where it is on the map. It's located there in the Middle East. As you can see, it's kind of wedged between, like the eastern side of Africa, the southern part of the Middle East, to the left there of South Asia. And as you could see on this more detailed map, okay, right to the south of Saudi Arabia, we have Yemen. Saudi Arabia is engaged in a war in Yemen, which is very important. To the right, we have the United Arab Emirates. Above that, I should say, across from that, you have the Persian Gulf, and you can also see Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia are really enemies, kind of essentially representing different kind of elements or different sects of, I guess would be a better way to say it, of Islam. You see, and above you have Jordan. You also have, above, kind of to the west of Iran, you have Iraq. All right, so you have Kuwait. So this is a very volatile region of the Middle East. There's a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of conflicts over resources, such as oil. To the right there of Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, you can see the Persian Gulf. There's conflicts. There's religious conflicts. There's obviously conflicts between like Israel and the Gulf states in general, though the Gulf states being the ones that are referenced here. There's conflicts between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And as I mentioned, like you can see the UAE. You can see it a little more detail on the map to the left, right where it is located. And on the right, you can see that it fits right in there with Saudi Arabia. Now, in terms of a little bit of background information, as you already learned in the general topic lecture, the U.S. is the largest arms supplier in the world. The United States essentially supplies approximately 1/3 of global arms. Saudi Arabia is the largest importer. So you have the largest exporter of arms selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is the largest importer. The U.S., at least recently, has generally been aligned kind of with countries that kind of follow more the Sunni sect of Islam versus Shia sect. So Shia Islam is represented by Iran, Syria, and then you have Shia terrorism. There can also be Sunni terrorism, and a lot of times these discussions of terrorism do not really kind of distinguish between the two. And, again, we don't want to say that these religions are sponsors of terror. They're certainly not. But when there are terrorists and they are representing they say their interests, they are Islamic terrorists. Sometimes they're representing, a particular religious sect, though the sect itself is not a sponsor of terrorism. That's just kind of really important to note because, like I say, you can see the U.S. is, kind of aligned with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, we're selling them a large number of weapons. We have defense agreements with them. Iran, on the other hand, we have extensive sanctions on Syria. We're trying to topple their leader, Assad. Now, it's always not so clear-cut, right? Like Saddam, he was a Sunni. Saddam was the leader of Iraq, and we overthrew him in 2003. The U.S. accuses, frequently accuses Saudi Arabia of promoting terrorism. We even say that Saudi Arabia was kind of supported the 9/11 attackers. There's different kind of theories as to how or which attackers they supported, and there's definitely a debate about that, but there are accusations of that floating around. Saudi Arabia also supports kind of a more conservative interpretation of Islam called Sufism, which the West, the United States in particular, does not see as very protective of human rights. So that kind of just gives you in terms of kind of the number of weapons being sold and imported, and then kind of getting a little bit of an understanding of the different countries in the region where the U.S. is aligned with different interests politically, and kind of consequentially, though not really intentionally, sometimes aligning with different sects of Islam, and sometimes how that can play out in a terrorism debate. Now, the third category of kind of information on this slide is related to Saudi Arabia. It's very important to this understanding that Saudi Arabia is ruled by a monarchy, and it has a king. Their current king is 82 years old, King Salman. He has an heir, his son, who goes by the initials MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and he is the heir to the throne. At first, when he kind of became more involved publicly, he was seen as a progressive. He allowed women to drive, he allowed them to attend football games, but he's not really a progressive like RBG, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, on the Supreme Court, goes by those initials. He has a lot of people killed. He played a few important roles kind of recently in Saudi Arabia. First of all, there was a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, who lived in the United States. He wrote a lot of articles that were very critical of Saudi Arabia and MPS in particular. Well, Khashoggi decided to get married. In order to get married, he had to get some documents. He was a Saudi citizen originally, and still was at the time of his death, I believe. He had to get some documents from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia said you can go pick those up at the embassy in Turkey, right? The U.S. has kind of a love-hate relationship with Turkey, but anyhow, he went into the embassy. He didn't come back out alive. Basically, he was murdered in the embassy by the Saudi government, probably under the direction of MBS. They cut up his body, they put it in a bag, they walked out with it. This just happened in the fall of 2018. This is very much relevant to the topic because a lot of people said when this happened that the United States needs to take a strong stand in favor of human rights. And the United States needs to, as a result of that, as a part of that strong stand, cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So that's very important. Second of all, when MBS was the defense minister, now he's basically kind of like, maybe think of him as like a vice president, like a high-ranking minister in Saudi Arabia. When he was the defense minister, he was really responsible for escalating the war in Yemen, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. Okay, but he was really responsible for escalating the war in Yemen, which is going to be a core part of this debate. So he's a very big player in Saudi Arabia. He's rising. You can just search his name. You'll see articles about him all over the internet. He's probably responsible for Khashoggi's death. He's responsible for escalating the war. People also say he's responsible for a number of additional crackdowns that have occurred internally in Saudi Arabia that have led to the arrest and torture of many political opponents. They just beheaded, I think it was 37 people in Saudi Arabia, one of which who was originally arrested as a teenager for like sending text messages and like opposition to the government and supporting a rally. A lot of the people that were executed were gay. So there's a lot of criticisms about kind of, even though he was originally presented as a reformer, he's really kind of cracking down on human rights. So people also kind of make the argument that generally the United States should suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of these human rights abuses. Just in kind of terms of a little bit more about the arms sales, you can see how Saudi Arabia's arms imports have dramatically increased over the last decade. And that there are currently more than 100, there's a lot of arms sales. The exact amount of the arms sales, there's a little bit of a debate about because Trump came out and said, look, we can't cut arms sales to Saudi Arabia. These are worth billions and billions of dollars, and he cited a $100 billion figure. So there's been a lot of debate about whether or not it's actually $100 billion. I mean, there clearly has been $100 billion worth of sales. A lot of those sales have already been completed. They started largely under the Obama administration. Some people say we still have approximately $3 to $4 billion more per year. That could increase a bit because the United States has also basically agreed to sell Theater High Area Altitude Defense, which is a missile defense system. There will also be a separate case about to Saudi Arabia. That we've decided to sell this weapon, so that could increase a little bit. It is important to note that Saudi Arabia has other potential suppliers but they are quite small. So they currently have, Russia supplies them some weapons, China supplies them weapons. Europe, there's a big debate about weapons sales in Europe because Germany cut off some sales and they make some of the critical components in the weapons. How many sales the UK has. The big thing to understand is that Russia and Chinese weapons are not interoperable with Western defense systems. So if the U.S. just didn't sell any more spare parts to one of its fighters to Saudi Arabia, they couldn't just go replace those with Chinese spare parts. There's a couple different ways of kind of simply understanding this, and ways I've seen it explained. Like you can't put a program that runs on Microsoft on a Mac, right? There is Word on both, but that's because there's a whole other Word version of Mac. You can't put different apps on you can't put an iOS app on an Android device, right? So these are very modern weapon systems, are very high tech, they're very sophisticated, they're very dependent on technology, and because of that, these weapon systems are not very interoperable. So most people say at the very least it would take Saudi Arabia a considerable period of time to update and completely change its weapon systems. Saudi Arabia does get drones from China and Russia, not really from the U.S. Trump has relaxed sales on drone exports, but those are still not very common. Saudi Arabia does want to develop its own defense industry. They started a project called the Saudi Arabian Military Industry, but it's very nascent, and it's trying to develop its own technologies. It doesn't really have a lot of technologies. The reason it buys so many weapons is it doesn't have its own industry. So in terms of alternative suppliers, you could say maybe the biggest threat is Saudi Arabia itself making its own weapons. In the short term, maybe they could get more Western weapons from Western Europe because those are a bit more interoperable. But switching systems generally, especially to sellers like Russia and China, take a very long time and be very difficult. And the evidence on that is very strong, and it's obviously something you're going to want to have prepared on the affirmative. In the evidence packets on the website, there's a lot of very strong evidence to that. Now, in terms of kind of the major focus of most Saudi Arabia affirmatives, they're talking about a war in Yemen. The war in Yemen started actually back in 2014, and maybe depending on here, even it kind of explains a little bit way back in 2012. Saudi Arabia had a government essentially kind of installed and protected in Yemen. For a variety of reasons, there were a number of rebels called the Houthi rebels, and they overthrew this government. Now, there's a big debate about why they did this. It could have been, they are Shia rebels, so it could be part of a religious conflict. Maybe they felt deprived of resources by the Saudi government. Maybe they just kind of wanted to take control to maintain their own political power. There's also a big debate as to how much they're backed by Iran, so maybe Iran instigated some of this. Regardless, these rebels toppled the government. Saudi Arabia has had its own interests, right? They don't want these to fall to outside groups. They certainly don't want Iran to have, essentially a proxy government right on their border. So what Saudi Arabia did is that, Saudi Arabia entered the war. And they tried to fight off the Houthi rebels. And most people thought that it would kind of be done in a short amount of time. Well, this war has continued. The war has escalated quite dramatically. You have, some people say 80, 100,000 people dead. You say there's evidence that says that there's 10 million people at risk of dying of famine because they're having trouble importing and distributing food. That, this is kind of it's a very kind of dire situation. Most people say it's the worst humanitarian situation in the world, right? So, that would be worse than Afghanistan, worse than North Korea. So it's a very, very bad situation. So there are a number of people who in kind of various ways that could represent different potential affirmative plans that we'll talk about call for cutting off U.S. arms sales generally to Saudi Arabia, and specifically calling for cutoff in the supply of the spare parts that we make, the spare parts, the training that we make available to Saudi Arabia, because they need these parts to fly the airplanes that really commit a lot of the bombings and a lot of the attacks in Saudi Arabia. And people argue that if we cut these off, then Saudi Arabia really wouldn't be able to execute the war anymore. It would force them to negotiate. Saudi Arabia is the major kind of party to the conflict. They do receive some support from the UAE, and the U.S. also sells weapons to the UAE. So some people say we should sell fewer weapons to the UAE as well. That would obviously help the affirmative solvency a bit, but that's kind of that's why the UAE can get involved in this debate. You might want to consider involving the UAE in your plan. But in terms of affirmative arguments, and I kind of have these listed generally, but these we're really talking about kind of affirmative advantages, right? Like, what advantages can affirmative teams claim from reducing arms sales to Saudi Arabia? The first one is that they could claim that so the first major argument on the affirmative in terms of an advantage is the one that I've kind of been talking about, throughout the presentation. The argument is that if the United States were to cut off sales, that would arrest Saudi Arabia's ability to execute the war in Yemen. And the affirmative will claim that this is a humanitarian catastrophe, that 85,000 have died. There's evidence that says that more than half of them are children. You can find evidence that says a child dies every 10 minutes, which seems to be a little bit of an exaggeration based on the 85,000 dead figure. But, you can show that a lot of people are dying. It is probably true that more than half of them are children, that there are, millions, potentially 10 million at risk of a famine because they can't distribute food, because they can't grow food, because, the water and everything's become so polluted. There's evidence that says that we're kind of a risk of a cholera epidemic, that things are really kind of spreading throughout throughout Yemen in a really terrible way. You can argue that this will lead to a wider war. There's a number of scenarios for that. Iran could become more directly involved in the conflict. You could have instability in Saudi Arabia. This could become kind of more dangerous to Saudi Arabia. They said you had the Persian Gulf right to the right of Saudi Arabia, which I believe is where, I think the statistic is that 1/3 of the world's oil flows through the Persian Gulf. There could be disruptions there. The United States could get involved. It could escalate to a larger Sunni-Shia conflict just generally. So there is some risk of potential escalation of that conflict outside of Yemen itself. There's also obviously arguments related to the morality of the United States continuing to just support the war. Specifically, then there's a question of, should we be providing aid to a dictatorship, to a monarchy, to human rights abusers? As I mentioned in the introductory part of this, there's been probably an escalation in human rights abuses under MBS's leadership. There's arguments about the freedom of the press. Remember, the person who was killed, Kamal Khashoggi, he was a journalist who was critical of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian government comes in, murders or has this person's murdered. What does the world do about it? Well, absolutely nothing, really. We could take a strong stand, and the evidence on that is pretty good. We could take a strong stand in terms of cutting off arms sales. Take a strong stand in terms of cutting off arms sales in order that Saudi Arabia, in order to kind of send a signal to the world that the U.S. really cares about press freedom. And in terms of signals to the world, we're also talking about human rights. Obviously, there are human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, as I just discussed. The murder of this journalist is a human rights violation. If the U.S. were to cut arms sales, the United States would be saying, hey, we take human rights violations seriously. We don't accept violations of human rights. Whereas if we don't do anything and we allow these violations of human rights to continue, then we're not a leader anymore in terms of international credibility and human rights. Same with democracy promotion on a similarly related theme. The United States, if we continue to sell arms to a dictatorship, right, if we ignore the role of democracy in the world, then there's evidence that says democracy will decline. That countries think, if the U.S. were to cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia because they're anti-democratic, maybe other countries would be more concerned that, that we sell arms to or we trade with in other ways, that they would be concerned if, they don't kind of maintain their democracy or, if they become less democratic in some way, then what the U.S. would maybe cut ties with them, and that might scare them, right? So economically or militarily. So then they'll be more likely to kind of protect their democracy. International law. I mean, international law. What international law is it's a little complicated to explain. But in international law, we have treaties, and we come and we abide by certain obligations internationally. Now, obviously, there's no enforcer of international law, which makes it a little bit tricky, right? There's enforcement of state, local, federal laws. If you violate the law, you're going to get a fine. You might go to jail. It's hard to enforce international law because we don't have like an international military that goes around and enforces international law, which could obviously create its own problems. But countries do sign on to international legal agreements. And the reason they do this is because they think it's in their interest, and they want countries to comply with other international legal agreements that might be in their interest. So, this might be inconsistent with human rights treaties. Something that's come up lately, although Trump just decided to violate it, is the Arms Transfer Treaty. There may be international conventions related to war and just war that these sales could violate. So that's like another potential advantage area. Soft power refers to how much a country is liked by other countries. It is a theory of international politics promoted by Joseph Nye at Harvard. And he says that it is important how much a country likes you because if another country likes you, they're more likely to trade with you. All right, so they're more likely to kind of support your economic power, which is obviously a part of global power. They're more likely to allow you to put a military base in their country, which is a form of hard power. So some people say that these arms sales they make the U.S. look kind of like bad, like countries don't like us. Here we are selling weapons to a monarchy where they're abusing a lot of human rights and like cutting up journalists and conducting wars in Yemen. Now, maybe in some ways those promote our hard power, which we'll talk about on the negative arguments, but that is a critical argument there, soft power. Global order is kind of a new concept, but it's a new frequently discussed concept in international relations literature. The idea is that after World War II, the U.S. helped form a lot of international institutions like the United Nations, right? And eventually the World Trade Organization. Different, as I mentioned, like international law. This is kind of where international law came about after World War II, different conventions and treaties that essentially between the United Nations, these trade agreements, these international laws, the idea was to kind of dampen conflict risks, to reduce conflict risks, to establish some norms, procedures, institutions, laws to kind of diffuse conflict. And that is generally referred to as the global order, right? We tried to have some order in the world to try to prevent the outbreak of conflict. And supporting dictatorships, selling lots of weapons to them, supporting aggressive military campaigns in other countries is pretty inconsistent with the international order. Now, in the global order. Now, of course, the reason this is written about is because a lot of people say Trump is opposed to this order, and he has been withdrawing from treaties and reducing support for our allies and reducing trade agreements and kind of undermining this international order. So obviously kind of a solvency argument you can make against this advantage, but nonetheless, there's kind of this general advantage area or theme that you can make a fact that there's kind of violations of like the international order that occur through these arms sales. Other people say, hey, look, these contribute to regional arms races, right? If the U.S. sells to Saudi Arabia, then Iran tries to purchase more weapons from China. You could see other countries in the region. Syria is, obviously kind of under attack by a lot of these rebel groups, but they're maybe trying to acquire more weapons, maybe Pakistan as well. Obviously, when one country acquires weapons, any country that's like an enemy of theirs, right, they try to acquire weapons to offset the gains that the first country has made. So maybe these weapons are contributing to a regional arms race. And there's also kind of some evidence that says, like within that, I'll put it there's some evidence that says that some of these weapons that we're giving to Saudi Arabia, they end up in the hands of terrorist groups. So for example, maybe Saudi Arabia will give these weapons to ISIS. This sounds strange, but ISIS is maybe fighting some other Shia terrorist groups. Right, so as I talked about in the beginning, a lot of times we just think of terrorism as just like grouping all the bad people into one category, but sometimes we support bad group A against bad group B, right? So maybe Saudi Arabia wants ISIS to confront Al Qaeda, right? Or, you may have a situation where it's vice versa. Maybe you want these weapons to go to Al Qaeda, which is responsible for the 9/11 attacks, because they're helping to defeat ISIS. So it can get a little bit more complicated, but there is kind of a basic argument that when we take these weapons and we give them to Saudi Arabia, they end up with other terrorist groups. And it's a general criticism of arms sales generally that we talked about in the first lecture. You can make arguments related to drone sales. Now, this would need a little bit more investigation. I found some evidence that says that the U.S. does sell some drones to Saudi Arabia, but that's usually very limited. The U.S. has not sold that many drones. Trump has relaxed the rules a little bit, but drone sales are something that the United States tries to limit a bit to control the technology, and it's actually something that China does a bit more. So I don't think that's like a super strong advantage, but debaters like debating about drones, so that's a possibility. There's a whole debate about U.S.-Saudi relations, which we'll talk more when we talk about the negative arguments. But the argument is that, basically that the U.S. sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, and in exchange for that, beyond buying the weapons, they also sell us oil at a low price. So there's evidence that says if if U.S.-Saudi relations go down, then what Saudi Arabia might do is they might reduce production of oil. When production of oil is decreased, prices rise. Just basic law of supply and demand, right? There's less oil on the international market. Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of oil. That could increase the price of oil. And the price of oil is set globally. So when the price of oil is set globally and the price of oil increases and people no longer can oil gets more expensive, we need oil to power our cars, to heat our homes, all these types of things that we use oil for. What happens is energy prices, they start hurting the economies of other countries. Now you can say on the negative that that's like a bad thing, right? Affirmative teams may say if the price of oil rises, that's good because renewable energy sources such as solar and wind become more cost competitive, right? So maybe it's good to increase the price of oil because that'll make renewable energy more cost competitive, and that'll fight global warming. And we have seen that that advantage run on some of these topics. Just also you could have general high oil prices, good arguments. Maybe raising the price of oil help increase Russia's economy. Maybe we want Russia to have economy so their economy doesn't go down and they don't have a war. As I discussed in the introductory section, the United States is currently selling theater, high area altitude defense to Saudi Arabia. There's a huge debate, as you may be aware, about whether or not we should be selling missile defense systems to other countries, whether or not missile defense systems are effective, whether or not missile defense systems cause arms races. Why would a defense system cause an arms race? Well, think about it. If you're Iran, right, and Saudi Arabia now has a missile defense system, okay? Now, if Saudi Arabia attacks you and they have a missile defense system, right? You're Iran, Saudi Arabia attacks you, they have a missile defense system, you can't fight back, okay? It's hard because they're just going to shoot down your missiles. Well, how are you going to compensate for the fact that you can shoot down your missiles? Well, you're going to build a lot more missiles, right? Because a missile defense system is only going to have so many interceptors, right? Yeah, a missile defense system, the missile goes up and it shoots down an incoming missile. Well, there's only so many missiles that, they have to be shot up, so to speak. So if Saudi Arabia has 48 missile defense interceptors and Iran has 100 missiles, right? Even if all of Saudi Arabia's missile defense interceptors are successful, which is usually not the case, Iran's going to be able to overwhelm those missile defense systems. There's an argument about the UN Arms Treaty, whether or not these sales violate the UN Arms Treaty. This quickly has become, I should say, a weak argument because because Trump just decided to back out of the UN Arms Treaty. The U.S. had not ratified the Arms Treaty, which means it's not fully in compliance with it, but we had signed it. Trump said he's going to unsign it, going to pull us out of this arms treaty, so it's probably not the best advantage. Other people say, look, Israel is kind of a debate both ways. Some people say Israel opposes these sales, so it hurts U.S. relations with Israel. Other people say the only way the U.S. can actually get to a peace process, an effective peace plan in the Middle East, is in order to get Saudi Arabia's support for the plan. So that's kind of a negative argument that cuts a little bit both ways. Now, we also those are kind of the general advantages that people can claim. So, there's a few different potential plans you could read. You could first of all stop all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and potentially the UAE. That's a general plan that could be debated. You could also maybe just stop offensive weapons sales. That's what some people say, that we should allow things like that to continue. We should stop offensive sales like precision-guided munitions, more military jets. I mean, obviously the difference between an offensive weapon systems and a defensive weapon system is a little bit debated because you don't really know like what, you need, if you're attacked, right, you need jets like to defend yourself. You need you need ammunition to defend yourself. So it is not a clean distinction between offensive and defensive weapon systems, but you may be able to say like, we'll cut everything except missile defense, or could even make that into a counter plan if somebody cuts all sales. Third thing is you could really kind of cut off the spare parts that are being used to support the planes. Because when planes take off and they engage in combat, even if they're it's just like your car, right? Except a jet fighter flies at like a very high intensity. So you need kind of to constantly be replacing parts and providing maintenance. And part of the arms sales agreements, as I discussed in the introduction, part of the arms sales agreements are actually to have spare parts, right? And to have maintenance. And there's a lot of good evidence that planes probably really couldn't fly without these Western companies like doing the maintenance and replacing the parts. They couldn't really get them from elsewhere. So that's kind of something that could be reduced immediately. There is a question of suspending sales, which I know is going to be a big debate on this topic, right? Topic says like reduce sales. Well, what if you just suspend them? You temporarily suspend them, and you say, well, we're not gonna sell you these weapons anymore until you stop the war in Yemen or until you push MBS out of power, right? There is evidence for both those points. Now the question is that a topical plan? Does that really reduce sales, right? Is the suspension a temporary reduction? That's something you could do some topicality work on, right? Or is this more of because that would be a really good plan if you could read something along like that, right? Or and even if a suspension is a reduction though, is adding a condition. Hey, if you only if you get rid of MBS, that's probably extra topical, right? To say that you're going to add this condition to the sales. So it's a bit difficult in terms of kind of probably making an affirmative plan. I think it'll end up being a negative counter plan, which in spite of the strength of this affirmative, and we're going to talk about negative arguments in the next presentation, in spite of the strength of this affirmative, it's a very strong negative argument because what most people advocate is not for permanently eliminating the sales, but for temporarily suspending them. Now, with that, we'll move on to we'll move on in the next presentation to the negative arguments. So in this third section, I'm going to talk about the negative arguments. So the negative arguments, there are kind of two categories or three categories I'll discuss: disadvantages, solvency arguments, and counterplans. The first set of arguments is probably really the strongest and most direct set, arguments that deal with Saudi-U.S. relations. There's really amazing evidence, as I mentioned earlier, that says that the United States sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, which they obviously desperately need, given the amount that they buy, and that they don't have a defense industry, and that they've become dependent on Western suppliers. All right, in exchange for that, Saudi Arabia sells oil at kind of relatively low prices and keeps that flow of oil flowing on the international market generally, which keeps the price of oil low since the price of oil is set globally, and makes it easy for the U.S. to purchase the oil. They don't embargo the oil. So there's really good evidence that says that the U.S. cut off arms sales, if they sanction Saudi Arabia in some way over these Khashoggi killings, which would include a cutoff of arms sales, they would dramatically reduce their production of oil, which would send the price of oil really high. There's even evidence that says it would send it to like $200 a barrel or $400 a barrel or something like that, right? So it's a really high price increase of oil that would really hurt our economy. The second thing is there's evidence that says it's two arguments related to terrorism. Maybe one, Saudi Arabia would sponsor terrorism or increase their sponsorship of terrorism, or more specifically, that they would reduce their cooperation, what's called counter-terror cooperation, with the United States. Now, you could say, why would Saudi Arabia do that? Why would Saudi Arabia reduce counter-terror cooperation when those groups threaten Saudi Arabia? Well, if you think about it, there's some terror groups that threaten Saudi Arabia. There's some terror groups that threaten the United States. that maybe Saudi cooperates with us to arrest in Category B, and there's some terror groups, right, that threaten both. Maybe Category C, right? So A is threatened Saudi Arabia, B is threatened only the United States, C is threatened both, right? So they're definitely going to continue cooperation with groups that threaten A and C, or at least they probably might. But if it's B, if they're just helping us, engage in counter-terror cooperation, what does that mean? Well, it means like sharing intelligence, sharing law enforcement resources, maybe sharing some police actions against those terror groups. If they're just groups that really kind of threaten the United States, but not Saudi Arabia, or not Saudi Arabia very much, they're not necessarily going to continue that cooperation. Saudi Arabia also has a lot of money. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Why? Not because they have a lot of industries, but because they have a lot of oil, and they sell this. They have these things something called a sovereign investment fund, right? It's owned by the government, and they invest heavily, all right, in U.S. technology, in the U.S. technology sector, in California, in Silicon Valley. They invest substantially in U.S. infrastructure development projects, right? Companies in the United States need to borrow a lot of money to build and develop, and a lot of times a good chunk of that money comes from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does also buy investments in U.S. debt. They're not really that substantial. But if we really hurt relations with Saudi Arabia, it's not just the fact that they might not buy our weapons anymore, and that might hurt our weapons manufacturers. There are kind of broader investments into the United States economy that they pull back on with retaliation. There's another argument related to regime stability. The argument is that Saudi Arabia uses some of these weapons, particularly the smaller weapons and the technologies, to actually kind of engage in surveillance and arrest people that are threats to the regime. Now, obviously, the flip side of this is when they do this, they're probably engaging in some human rights violations. But there is kind of a lot of threats to the regime that could increase, right, if the United States kind of cut back on the tools that they use to engage in this surveillance, to engage in these military police actions. And if the regime's threatened, there's a lot of instability in the region, like as I showed you on the map. It's right there next to the Persian Gulf. That could kind of spill over into instability in the Gulf. There's evidence that says Saudi Arabia will invade Qatar. Country there. You see right near Saudi Arabia, they're kind of a feud with them. There's a trade dispute. They cut off trading with with Qatar. They tried to put on a blockade. Some people say that if the United States did not have this relationship with Saudi Arabia, they would be more aggressive to Qatar. That essentially it's our relations with them that check them from invading Qatar because we tell them not to do that. As I mentioned earlier, we might need Saudi support for the recent initiatives the United States has in the Middle East related to the peace process between Israel and Palestine and other groups in that region. There's also evidence that says we need Saudi support because the United States is backing the opposition, different opposition groups, which some people may say are terrorist groups, right? Different opposition groups to Assad. Assad is the leader of Syria. Also has committed a lot of human rights violations. The United States is afraid to overthrow Assad because of instability in the region, but we like pressure against the government. We have military forces deployed there. Well, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, right, Saudi Arabia is also kind of against the Syrian regime. It's a Shia regime, right? Saudi Arabia is against that. There is a Shia regime. It's aligned with Iran. So Saudi Arabia and the United States have a mutual interest, is of kind of pushing back against the Shia government, right? So the argument is that they'll no longer support that and cooperate with us as much in that endeavor if we alienate them by cutting off arms. There's also kind of general arguments just related to the U.S. influence in the region. That Saudi Arabia is our friend, that they're our ally in the region, that it helps us build ties with other countries in the region, obviously like the UAE, all right? And, maybe we probably have, some military, I don't know if they're like bases, but we probably definitely have some military resources probably deployed into Saudi Arabia. We could deploy military resources there potentially if we needed to. So it just kind of gives us a lot of influence. It gives us a friend in the region. It might help us with the containment of Iran. The United States obviously and Iran are enemies. Trump even backed out of the Iran nuclear deal. They're always kind of threatening to attack Iran. The United States is. So we're always saying that Iran is a threat. We're saying that they sponsor terrorism, right? So they back the Syrian government, which we oppose. So this kind of gives us an ally in the region that helps counter Iran's influence. that kind of provides like a cooperative military framework to work with in the event of Iranian aggression, or if we want to be aggressive towards Iran. Those are all important things. We also sell THAAD, right? As I mentioned earlier, the Theater High Area Altitude Defense. This is good, obviously. Maybe missile defense systems are good because they can shoot down incoming missiles, potentially Houthi missiles out of Yemen, potential Iranian missiles out of Iran. They also, you'll see if you read a lot about missile defense, there's a lot of arguments about interoperability and how missile defense systems work together, right? So you have similar missile defense systems being deployed. You have cooperative radar networks being built and surveillance networks. You need those cooperative surveillance and radar networks because what happens is you need radar to detect, or some type of surveillance system to detect the launch of a missile from another country. And when you see the launch of a missile from another country coming in, right, that's what enables you to shoot it down. You have to be able to detect the launch in the first place. So building cooperative, interoperable missile defense systems is very important. There's good evidence that says, well, there's debatable. I think that the affirmative evidence on this is a little bit stronger. But there's evidence that says these sales help support our economy, right? They provide jobs. And more importantly, that they do contribute to the defense industrial base of the country, right? If our defense contractors are stronger and our defense contractors have more revenue, then they can develop more products. They can have new innovations. Their costs actually decrease, right? Because they're selling the same weapon to they're selling essentially more copies of the weapon, right? So that means they can sell the weapons to the U.S. government for less, right? Think about it. If you're a defense contractor and you're contracted to develop and build like one plane, right? Think how much you'd have to charge the U.S. government for that one plane. But if you sell 100 planes to the U.S. government, you sell 100 planes to Saudi Arabia, making 200 planes kind of the net, the individual production costs of those decline. And like I say, it gives you increased revenue for more innovation. You can say the Houthis are bad. That's that Houthi rebel group. We'll talk about more of this in the solvency arguments. There's good evidence that says that the U.S. just kind of cut off Saudi Arabia and they couldn't fight the war. The Houthis would actually be more aggressive towards Saudi Arabia. You can also kind of argue that Al-Qaeda is bad. Like I said, maybe some of these weapons are getting diverted to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You can argue that. You can argue it's bad to end the war quickly. That what we really need to do, instead of just kind of having a war and having a stalemate amongst the parties and kind of some kind of fragile peace agreement, it's better just let the U.S. kind of support Saudi Arabia and for the war to end. You could say that they'll shift to China, maybe that and or Russia, and these arguments are similar, right? That this would boost China's and Russia's defense industrial base. You could say that China and Russia would sell them more drones and that drones are worse. You could even say China and or Russia's increased influence in the Middle East relative to the United States is bad, right? Especially if you have like kind of larger, more general impacts. You can say these are things that occur over time. Sure, even if it takes Saudi Arabia like 5 or 10 years to switch, okay, then but in 5 or 10 years you're going to have a lot more Chinese and Russian influence in the Middle East, which is really, really bad. The politics angle on this is a little bit unclear. There is a lot of opposition in Congress to the war. They did just try to reduce the U.S. support for the war, not through banning arms sales, but by kind of supporting. The U.S. provides kind of some indirect military support to the war. Congress tried to cut that off. The president vetoed it. They didn't have enough votes to override the veto. So there's a congressional opposition. Is it enough to override? But that already exists. Is it enough to override a veto? Would the politics DA play out in terms of you would say that in order for the plan to pass, Congress would have to cut sales. The president would veto that. Congress would then have to override him to make it work. Maybe that would make the president look weak. So I think how this is going to play out is in a politics DA, it's not going to be your normal politics DA because it's obviously something the president would not push for. And if he did, right, if the negatives argument is the president's to push for this, he's not going to push very hard because Congress mostly already supports it, right? So it'd be more like the president going along with Congress. If it were to pass in the real world, the most likely route would be that it would pass over the president's veto, right? And maybe if Trump got overridden, maybe that would weaken him politically, right? You have to have a lot of support, political support, and opposition to the president in order to have a veto overridden. So that would be interesting. In terms of solvency arguments, I think there are a lot of pretty good solvency arguments. I talked about the first set in terms of disadvantages, but right, they would shift to Russia or China sales, especially over the long term. It's not just that those sales would then fill in, right? But it would give those countries more influence in the region or allow them to use drones, which is a disadvantage. You could argue that if you want more short-term arguments, you'd probably want to focus on Western Europe, that they could try to maybe get the weapons from France or the UK. There is recent evidence that says they are still getting, weapons from those, and those weapons are more interoperable, right? There are Western defense systems. So if the U.S. left, maybe they could get them from there. Maybe even if it was a little hard for them to transition, it wouldn't be a complete transition, right? Because our weapon systems are interoperable. So some alternative suppliers are pretty good. You can make an indigenous production argument. That's probably not the best argument. Because the problem with that argument is we know they don't have a defense industry. That would take a long time. There is evidence, really good evidence, however, that says they already have a lot of weapons to continue to fight the war for a long time. Like, even if you just win, they could continue to fight the war with the weapons they have for 6 months. That gives them like 6 months to kind of add in some more weapons from Western Europe, which are more easily adaptable, right? So they add those weapons in to the weapons that they already have. They engage in, that allows them to sustain their aggression. Now, if they did actually reduce their aggression, you could say the Houthis would become more aggressive, right? There's no reason, like, remember, the Houthis were arguably the original aggressors, and now they're kind of really mad at the Saudis because they've been killing a whole bunch of Yemenis, right? So if the Saudis just can't fight anymore, there's no reason to think the Houthis would just say, sure, right? We'll just give up. That doesn't make any sense. Think about two people have been like in just like a street fight for like an hour, and then the one side like loses their weapon. It doesn't mean the other side's just going to walk away, right? It means they might attack the other person, right? So just kind of eliminating one side's weapons may not be the best approach, right? And we talk more about the conditions counterplan. It's like, well, we're going to reduce your weapons if you don't make a peace deal. That's kind of a stronger argument, right? Because it's like, we're going to reduce your weapons if you don't make a peace deal. That means there's a peace deal in place, right? And maybe the weapons don't ever get reduced, okay? Rather than just like taking the weapons away and giving the Houthis like a big advantage. There's also evidence that says like, if it lost its weapons, they would become very insecure, right? They become nervous. Now we know they still have, even if they lost their weapons, we know they still do have a considerable amount of weaponry. So maybe in the short term, what they do is they'd be like super aggressive. They think, okay, we're cut off. We only have what we have left. So let's like use it all. Let's go in for the win and be super aggressive. All right, in Yemen. So there's evidence that makes that argument too. In the evidence packet, there's like a very recent card. It's kind of short. It's just like one sentence that makes that statement. But then there's an older card from 2015 that really kind of like develops and really like explains the argument. So I think that older card from 2015 combined with a more recent shorter card for 2018 can really make a powerful argument. And I haven't seen a lot of direct answers to that. There's also evidence that says that the U.S. tries at least to like encourage Saudi Arabia to not target like funerals and like hospitals and civilian targets. We give the Saudis targeting information to try to get them to target like kind of aggressive, actual military threats in Yemen, like the Houthi rebels and stuff like that. Now, there is evidence that says that those things are ignored, but that's another kind of solvency turn you can make. But I do think it's kind of just compelling generally to say, like, look, if you just cut off the Saudis' weapons, right, maybe they couldn't fight, but then the Houthis are going to be much more aggressive. The Houthis become much more aggressive, then, and then, there's even a bigger war, and that war, like, spreads into Saudi Arabia, then maybe the U.S. would try to back Saudi Arabia in other ways, or resell the weapons. You could obviously get into a fiat debate about that, or, if they're kind of getting overrun from Yemen, then what happens with the Iran? Are they going to be more aggressive towards Saudi Arabia? So I think that there is a lot of really strong affirmative evidence that kind of talks about how horrible the war in Yemen is, and that then there's affirmative evidence that kind of says we should reduce the sales. Sort of. I'll talk about that in a second, right? But you got to think about, like, there is, like, just kind of unilaterally cutting off one side of the party in a fight that's kind of completely dependent on you. In different ways, that could kind of encourage the aggression and, like, victory of the other party, which may just get us to the same impact through a different route. So I think the counter plans in the debate are strong, especially a conditions-type counter plan that says, hey, Saudi Arabia, you could do it two ways. Like, you could say, look, if you don't stop the war in Yemen, we're going to cut sales. Now, that's only so much of a threat because we're always kind of like threatening that. They probably trust that Trump will kind of block any efforts by Congress to actually cut the sales and they won't be able to override his veto, right? But that's kind of one way of threatening. And the second thing you could do is what's called a suspension. You could say, look, we're going to suspend sales for 60 days. If you don't stop the war, then we're going to reduce the sales. You're not going to get them anymore. That's a more credible condition, right? Because now I say, look, there is political support in the U.S. to actually not sell us the weapons anymore. They at least got a suspension passed. Now, that just because suspension passes Congress doesn't mean or the government in general, Trump doesn't veto it, doesn't mean a reduction will, but it makes it more likely. So it really kind of puts Saudi Arabia on notice that, hey, these weapons could go away, right? And Saudi Arabia could really get nervous. Maybe they'll stop the war in Yemen. You could do the same thing with human rights. You could suspend the sales and say, if you don't improve your human rights practices in some way, we won't resume these. If you don't get MBS out of power, resume these. Latter two, human rights kind of hard to define, right? How are we going to really determine if they make progress? MBS, he's the heir to the throne. It would probably take a lot for them to get rid of the heir to the throne. Every country has some pride, right? So I think those latter two conditions are probably not the best ones, but I do think there's a reasonable thing to a conditions counter plan to suspend sales. Rather than reduce sales, you're essentially suspending the sales and then threatening the reduction. Now, that depends on kind of winning debates about reduce means, right? Maybe meaning reduce is permanent as opposed to suspension. We'll talk about that a lot more at a different time, and we have someone writing an essay on that theory. But I do think it's going to be a big counterplan, and I think in this context, especially even if you look closely at what some of the quote-unquote affirmative solvency evidence is saying, it's saying that you should suspend the sales and not reduce them. Transparency, these other counterplans I don't think probably the next three anyhow kind of solve very well. Transparency would just say be more public about what's going on with the sales so people can criticize them. Okay, that doesn't mean that's going to lead to suspension of the sales. Other people say don't directly support the war, don't provide intelligence sharing, but allow the sales to continue. Okay, it's really not going to solve that much of the problem. It may even make targeting worse. If the Saudis don't have our support but have our weapons, they maybe do even worse things with them. Other people say you should certify it, Trump would have to certify the Saudis aren't committing human rights abuses, or that they reduce offensive aggression in Yemen. The problem with these counterplans is just a judgment call. The president can always certify them. There's really good evidence that since he wants to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, he'll just certify the sales. So I think the first conditions counterplan is really good. I don't think that the next three counterplans are very good at all. And I do think that the last one, however, pick out of offensive weapon systems, which I could have phrased that a little bit differently. Pick out of offensive weapon systems or pick out of defensive weapon systems. What I mean by that is just don't allow the sales of the offensive weapon systems, however we're going to define them. And you'd need to be ready to give examples like precision-guided missiles, more fighter jets, but allow the defensive weapons, so like THAAD, right, or other missile defense systems. And you may want to come up with a couple other examples. Allow those to continue, assuming that's not the affirmative plan. Because it's clearly topical. The affirmative doesn't have to reduce all weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and or the UAE, right? They can choose some that they're going to reduce. So they could just reduce the quote-unquote offensive systems, in case this counterplan would not be competitive. But if they just reduce if they reduce all of them, then I think this is a good counterplan, a competitive counterplan. I think you'll struggle. I think with this counterplan, you'll struggle with the competition a little bit. I don't think the affirmative will say, in their plan, reduce all weapon sales. They'll just say, reduce weapon sales. So if the plan says, reduce weapon sales, and your counterplan, you say, well, don't eliminate THAAD, right? Continue selling them THAAD. They'll say, well, we never said reduce all weapon sales. We just said reduce weapon sales. So permute, reduce weapon sales except THAAD, right? That's kind of consistent with that's not really a severance permutation or anything like that. You could debate the theory out a little bit, but I think that would be hard for the negative to win, that's a competitive counterplan, because I think they're right about what I just said, and I think more importantly, they're not going to say reduce all sales. But I do think the first counterplan, the negative, will probably end up winning the competition on this, that is suspension is not a reduction. So as long as they can win that debate, I think that conditions counterplan becomes very strong. right? And then if you just flip back to like the solvency arguments, you can use things of like Houthi aggression, right, as like a net benefit to the counterplan. So, and even like a lot of these disadvantages could stay because you're essentially saying, look, we're going to maintain the arms sales over the long term, but we're just going to solve the Yemen crisis. Now, of course, this does assume that like the only advantage they're really reading is Yemen. They can read other advantages, and you can debate about whether or not the counterplan would solve for those. So for example, just if the affirmative also has an arms race advantage, then the counterplan is not going to solve for that, right? Because it would allow, essentially, you're going to say the sales are going to continue in the future once they stop fighting in Yemen. Well, it's not going to solve your arms sales advantage. So I do think it's very important in terms of kind of setting up and structuring your affirmative. I think the Yemen advantage is very strong, but I don't think it's the only advantage. And I do think the conditions counterplan is very strong. So I think you're going to want to, maybe in addition to the Yemen advantage, have an advantage that the conditions counterplan does not solve for. Anyhow, this was just meant as kind of a very kind of broad introduction to the Saudi arms sales affirmative. I think it'll be a popular case, and I think you should be prepared to debate it. I think you'll find some of the arguments similar on other cases in terms of kind of type. So I think that, just learning this, whether you run the case or not, can be very important to you. And there is really a lot to kind of promote the evidence packets for a minute. There's a lot of really good evidence in these packets. They're each about 300 pages. They've been updated regularly. By regularly, they're updated every single day. And you can access those as a subscriber on the website. So I look forward to kind of working with people continually on these arguments and the Saudi arms sales arguments in particular.